One of the more prevalent beliefs in our society is that everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story. Even though the idea of a hero can hold many meanings for various people, most of us would like to believe our actions provide some kind of benefit, either for us or the world at large. In the world of storytelling, the most celebrated heroes are often the ones willing to risk everything in order to protect a noble ideal or the people they care about most, even against a ruthless entity who's willing to kill them in order to get what they want. However, this can also be the mindset that drives many characters who would traditionally be seen as morally dubious or outright evil, and in some cases, can end up making them far more interesting than the central protagonist. A complex villain or anti-hero has the potential to bolster almost any kind of story when done well, which is why many modern stories have strayed away from depicting clear-cut heroes versus villains, even in recent superhero movies and video games. That being said, it also has the potential to seriously damage the noble principles the heroes stand for, and in the worst cases, ends up making both them and the villains look like despicable hypocrites. It takes a careful balance and unbiased perspective to make a good, sympathetic villain, and I'd like to explore what that entails in this video. I'll be going through examples of both great ones and terrible ones, so I'll try to give as clear an overview as I can for those people who haven't seen the stories I'm covering. So, what makes good villains and anti-heroes, and how do they bolster a story? Let's get into it. It's easy to give any character a tragic backstory or an understandable goal, but it takes more than that to make a good, sympathetic villain. Traditional villains tend to have a warped perception of the world or people around them, which, in their minds, justifies all of their assertive and often brutal actions to accomplish their goals. Whether they're a power-hungry tyrant, a cold-blooded murderer, or just a plain psychopath, they would be labeled the antagonists of most stories because they put more value on what they want over the well-being of others, and are willing to use drastic measures like murder, extortion, or deception in order to get their way. So how do you go about making someone like that sympathetic, you may ask? The best ways, in my opinion, is to explore their values, how they came to have that kind of mindset, and most importantly of all, showing the similarities and differences between their beliefs and the beliefs of the protagonist, or any other characters with conventional morality they're pitted against. I say it's the most important because it effectively conveys what principles their characters stand for and establishes just how strongly they believe in them when they're challenged. There's no better way to get to know a character than to see just how far they'll go for the things most important to them, or what they do in the face of setbacks or even failures. One of the best stories that illustrates this concept is Star Trek Deep Space Nine, with the characters of Commander Sisko and Gul Dukat, the latter of which happens to be my favorite sympathetic villain of all time. On the surface, Gul Dukat seems like a complete monster like any other Cardassian, whose empire overran the planet of Bajor and basically conducted a holocaust by subjecting its people to labor camps and other deplorable acts for decades. As the chief overseer of the station, Dukat himself admits to committing many of these atrocities. So how could this genocidal tyrant possibly be sympathetic, you may ask? Well, the show goes about this by portraying Dukat as a pragmatic and loyal individual, a man who believes in a strict and somewhat self-serving code of justice, and would do anything for the admiration of the people serving under him, and even the respect of his enemies through his perceived sense of fair play.
You ask me, the key to holding the Federation is Earth.
You can't do that.
Why not?
Because a true victory is to make your enemies see they were wrong to oppose you in the first place. To force them to acknowledge your greatness.
Then you kill them.
Only if it's necessary. You simply lack the commitment it takes to do what is necessary.
You tell that to the crew of the Bachmor.
Oh, anyone can blow up a ship. But to look your enemy in the eye, knowing you'll remember his face for the rest of your life, now that takes a stomach much stronger than you'll ever have.
Some of the best scenes of the entire show consist of him debating characters like Commander Cisco or Major Kira over how his brutal methods ended up saving more lives for the greater good, and his belief that he was a benevolent dictator during Beijuo's occupation. Even though he can be a ruthless bastard with a superiority complex, the show devotes equal time towards showing him being a caring father, a reasonable ally, and an efficient leader when the situation calls for it.
When my son looks back on this day, the only thing he'll remember is that a Federation officer on a Federation ship invaded his home and kept his father away from him on his 11th birthday. He'll look back with hatred. And that's sad.
I don't understand. You're a Cardassian.
I'm not just any Cardassian. I'm Gul Dukat, commander of the Second Order. You have 15 seconds to lower your shields or we'll destroy you.
No, wait.
10 seconds.
No, it's not that simple.
7 seconds.
I've already been paid.
4 seconds.
Stop counting. Stop counting.
I think you can handle it from here.
DS9 slowly pivoted him towards being more overtly evil than morally grey as the show went on, but Gul Dukat remains one of the most compelling characters in all of Star Trek, because even his most heinous actions have a line of logic behind them. Deep Space Nine is a show all about exploring the various cultures across the Star Trek universe in great depth, and it owes a great deal of its success to nuanced characters like Gul Dukat. Someone who could point out the inherent flaws in the Federation's ideology to exploit them in one scene, and confess to Cisco that all of his numerous duties have driven a wedge between him and his son, which regrettably will lead to him hating the aliens that keep his father busy all the time in the next. That's the impact a well-written, sympathetic villain can have in a story all about exploring both sides of a conflict. When an audience can understand the context behind what makes a character tick, whether they be good or bad, it allows them to come across as believable people despite being actors in costumes or elaborate makeup. I could go on, but I don't want to give the impression that just making every villain sympathetic always makes a story better. While it's true that some of the more interesting villains can be seen as the heroes of their own story, the last thing you want to do as a writer is to come across to your audience like you're making cheap excuses for their terrible actions. It's become a very bad trend lately, such as with Reva from the Kenobi series, Simpron from the Rings of Power, or, in one of the worst examples of it I've seen, Scarlet Witch from Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, where she literally goes around murdering countless innocent people and risks destroying the entire multiverse so she could steal a pair of dream children from an alternate version of herself. It would be one thing if the movie acknowledged she was completely out of her mind, but it honestly goes out of its way to express just how tortured she is because the love of her life is dead and she's all alone, even though there's a clone of him running around, and someone else has to point out to her that the kid she's stealing won't exactly be fond of her after she's killed their real mother. It ends up making Stephen Strange and the other Avengers look like moronic, irresponsible pansies for not even being able to hold her accountable for enslaving an entire town, to the point where they begged her to kill them rather than play out her twisted fantasy. By jumping through so many hoops to make a deranged psychopath appear sympathetic, it has the effect of tarnishing the audience's perception of the heroes they're meant to be invested in. The real irony is, there was already a Marvel story that directly pointed out that committing ruthless crimes over a tragic backstory doesn't excuse them in any way, and that the character in question had no moral leg to stand on, while also admitting he regretted having to do them in the first place.
What I said about what I want for this city is the truth. Money and influence is not enough to usher change on such a scale. Sometimes it requires force.
I know you're a dangerous man.
Would you like to leave?
No. I'd like a reason to stay.
What makes Wilson Fisk so fascinating yet terrifying as a character is that he wants the same thing as Matt Murdock. Their childhoods are even eerily similar, having grown up with struggling families that experience the blatant corruption and miserable conditions of the city firsthand, which pushes them to try to make things better as adults. The key difference between them is that Matt uses his abilities as both a lawyer and a superhero to ensure every compassionate and hard-working person can continue living their lives in peace, while also standing up for the ones that the thugs and the elites see fit to exploit and abuse. Fisk, on the other hand, endeavors to be the one on top who decides how everyone beneath him should live their lives. He believes that the best way to fulfill his idealized vision for Hell's Kitchen is by forcing others to submit to his designs or else be crushed on the path to progress. That's the philosophy his father drilled into him as a child, and in a twisted irony, that lesson is also what drove a young Wilson to murder his father, since his constant abuse and corrupt dealings would get in the way of him making a name for himself. All of this is covered brilliantly in a single episode, where we see that even as an adult, he's still grappling with those disturbing events, and strives to only use cruelty as a means to an end.
You were protecting your mother.
I didn't do it for her. I did it for me. That's why I still wear these. To remind myself that I'm not cruel for the sake of cruelty. That I'm not my father. That I'm not a monster.
Wilson Fisk from Daredevil is the best comic book villain ever put to screen because he's both a formidable monster and the audience really gets to understand the man behind the monster. His scenes with Vanessa, his assistant Wesley, and Madame Gao all expose his deeper vulnerabilities as a person. A man who's lived in isolation for most of his life, yearns for companionship, and wants to build a better future for everybody. At the same time, the audience wants Matt Murdock to stop him because he's willing to ruin innocent people's lives, murder anyone who displeases him, or manipulate people to do his dirty work for him in order to achieve his goals. Even though they both want to fix Hell's Kitchen, it's clear that Kingpin's vision for it would cause more harm than good. And a peace built on the suffering and exploitation of others is something a moral person like Matt Murdock can't abide by. You don't see many people in the real world hand-waving the crimes of serial killers or child predators, so why should characters in a story that's trying to have compelling drama and serious stakes be free from that scrutiny? If a character in a story can't be held accountable for their actions, either by others or by their own admission, then any deeper motivation or sympathetic goal you try to give them will fall flat, because then it becomes clear to the audience that the writer is playing favorites and can't fairly assess their creations through an objective standpoint. You could argue both Gul Dukat and the Kingpin are both despicable hypocrites on a base level, like most villains, but what separates them from the insufferable kind is that neither one tries to pass off their actions as virtuous, at least in the sense that the heroes are morally wrong for opposing them, and they don't spit out sob stories to make themselves look better. Instead, the audience gets a clear understanding of their methodologies, and can judge for themselves whether they're monsters when they're directly confronted on their ideals. Put simply, it's the difference between being given clear reasons to feel sorry for somebody and being told you should feel sorry despite all the horrible things that person does. It ends up making your story feel like cheap dollar store fanfiction, and it makes the characters who are meant to be relatable or imposing come across as annoying crybabies instead. Antiheroes have become exceedingly popular over the last few years, and it's not hard to see why. While a traditional hero is usually bound by a strict code of honor and nobility, anti-heroes give writers the opportunity to explore just how far they can push the idea of a traditional hero with a character who's usually conflicted, self-serving, and not quite so virtuous at their core. It also gives them the chance to play around with the fundamental tenets of storytelling, since an anti-hero is driven by more unique motivations than just doing the right thing or being the traditional savior. One of the best examples of this is Dexter Morgan, who's far from the model citizen given his serial killer lifestyle, but you can't exactly call him a total monster since he takes out other serial killers. Dexter was a great anti-hero up until season 5 of the show, because even though he's a calculating sociopath with a dark impulse to kill, the audience gets a clear understanding of his principles through his code of only killing individuals who see fit to prey on innocent people. Despite being detached from the very concept of feelings, he eventually grows to care for his adopted sister and his girlfriend, who were nothing more than distractions or tools for his cover identity at the beginning. At the same time, the show never portrayed the act of killing as a one-size-fits-all solution to all of his problems, at least until season 6, and provided plenty of repercussions for his reckless and self-serving lifestyle. One of the many trappings modern writers fall into with anti-heroes is their compulsion to glorify them and not provide any meaningful downside to their devil-may-care actions, or, in the worst cases, try to turn deplorable villains into anti-heroes in a vain attempt to make their stories seem more complex. While it's true that making every hero into an infallible Boy Scout or a Mary Sue is incredibly boring, it's a writer's job to make them interesting by exploring what drives them to do the right thing and show how willing they are to put their own lives in danger in order to preserve what they care about. By contrast, an anti-hero is more motivated to doing right by them than worrying about the needs of others. And while they do have a stronger sense of what's right and wrong compared to a villain, they're still willing to suspend conventional morality in order to get what they want. That's the key distinction that separates them from a traditional hero, and you need that contrast in order to establish how strongly they believe in their own values. Otherwise, the audience has no clear perception of what separates them from the villains. There's no better scene that showcases this than the conversation Daredevil has with Punisher in the second season of his show. They end up being at odds because Frank Castle goes the extra mile by wiping out the scum of the underworld, as he puts it, while Matt Murdock refuses to kill because he knows it would turn him into a careless lunatic like Frank and rob those people of any chance to atone for their crimes. The audience gets a fascinating interplay as the two of them argue against each other's methods, with Frank insisting that Hell's Kitchen will remain a crime cesspit because Matt's caught in a cycle of beating up thugs that will always go on to do the same crimes once they get released, whereas Matt points out it's not their call to execute people on the spot, since not every criminal is the same heartless degenerate at their core, and it would deny those people any chance to make up for their mistakes.
I think that this world, it needs men that are willing to make the hard call. That's what I think. I think you and me are the same. We're the same. You know it. Only I do the one thing that you can't. You hit them and they get back up. I hit them and they stay down.
Let me ask you this.
What's that?
What about hope?
Oh, fuck.
Come on, Frank.
About Santa Claus? You want to talk about Santa Claus?
I live in the real world,
Yeah.
too, and I've seen it.
What have you seen?
Redemption, Frank. It's real. And it's possible. The people you murdered deserve another chance.
What, to kill again, rape again? Is that what
No,
you
Frank,
want?
to try again, Frank. To try. And if you don't get that, there's something broken in you can't fix. And you really are a nut job.
This is one of the best scenes in any superhero story, because both sides have merits to their arguments and valid critiques of each other's philosophies. Since the show is all about pushing Daredevil to his absolute limits, this scene is integral to his development by establishing that even though he is one bad day away from becoming someone like Frank Castle, people need someone like him to inspire hope rather than fear or savagery. It's far from an easy task to stay true to his ideals, but what makes Daredevil such an inspiring character is that no matter how many times he gets beaten down, either by the struggles in his life, the world conspiring against him, or incredibly tough opponents, he always gets back on his feet because he knows he's the only one who can take on all of these burdens. That's what makes him a great hero, and that's also what makes Frank Castle a great foil to him as an anti-hero, since he more or less believes in doling out justice, but just goes about it in his own extreme way. So now that I've shown what a great anti-hero can do for a story when paired with an equally well-developed hero, how does the inverse of that ruin a narrative, you may ask? Well, look no further than Abby from The Last of Us Part 2, who may just be one of the most deplorable and unsympathetic characters I've ever seen. For context, The Last of Us Part 2 deliberately sets Abby up to look like a complete monster for brutally murdering Joel, the protagonist of the first game, right in front of Ellie, his adopted daughter who was forced to watch his skull get caved in with a golf club. The first half of the story follows Ellie's journey across the post-apocalyptic city of Seattle as she hunts down Abby and all of her friends, only for the game to switch to Abby's perspective halfway through, in order to reveal that actually, she killed Joel because Joel killed her father, a doctor from the first game who wanted to perform a fatal operation on Ellie in an attempt to create a vaccine to the fungus parasites that brought the world to ruin. It goes on to emphasize she actually cares a lot about her friends, her dog, and 2 runaway kids from the crazy cult her group is fighting, the latter of which drives her to throw away her old life and friends in order to protect them, similar to what Joel did when he met Ellie in the first game. Now, on paper, Abby sounds like a very compelling character. Unfortunately, the context the game tries to give to Abby's actions, along with the way she's presented, only make her come across as a complete hypocrite and deranged sociopath. Let's put aside all of the logistical and moral reasons why Joel was completely justified in saving Ellie and preventing the Fireflies from killing her in order to create the cure, so we can judge her actions based solely on the context this game provides.
Please stop! Please don't shoot! Joel, please get up!
This scene functions on a base level if the intention is to make Abby look like a psychopathic murderer that Ellie has every reason to want to take revenge on, but in the context of trying to make her appear sympathetic and set up her redemption arc, it falls completely flat. The fact Abby doesn't realize she's doing exactly what Joel did to her, only 10 times worse because now she's forcing someone else to watch their loved ones die right in front of them, just speaks to how narcissistic and hypocritical she really is. Not to mention stupid because she lets Ellie and Joel's brother Tommy go afterward. People have argued that was just her being courteous towards them, but considering she and her friends took no precautions to ensure they don't come after them for revenge, especially when this is the exact same scenario that made her swear a bloodthirsty vendetta, I can only conclude everyone in this room is a complete idiot and a slave to the contrived plot. One of The Last of Us 2's biggest issues is its compulsion to constantly excuse Abby's actions. All of her friends end up getting killed because she guilt-tripped and manipulated them to support her Joel in 1 session, but no one gets to really confront her over that. Not even her supposed best friend, who she has the gall to insult after he confesses he wants to get away from this violent lifestyle.
Okay. We'll talk in the morning when you're sober.
Don't do that.
Do what?
Treat me like I'm fucking insane. You feel the same way.
If the Fireflies are in Santa Barbara, I go the opposite fucking direction. Sorry I grew up. You should try it.
They have electricity, guns. It's a lot of people.
We can figure it out.
When everyone else sees this, they're gonna want to turn back.
We can convince them, right? I fucking knew I couldn't count on you.
Abby, I want what you want. Hey.
Don't.
I'm not giving up my friend.
Do you see the problem yet? Abby never gets the equivalent of the Daredevil Punisher scene, where she's forced to confront the deep flaws in her personality or reflect on how her careless bloodlust led to so many devastating consequences. The scene where Mel calls her a piece of shit comes close, but it doesn't go far enough into laying out how her decisions have only made things worse for everyone around her, in addition to being entirely self-motivated and egocentric, and immediately gets undercut 2 seconds later when Yara turns up and says, "Oh, you're not such a bad person," even though she's barely known Abby for a few hours. Owen got my hopes up in this scene when he began pointing out how Abby's obsession with revenge was mostly to satisfy her bloodlust and actually getting justice, even acknowledging how screwed up it was for her to beat him to death. Unfortunately, it gets cut short by an over-the-top sex scene that makes no sense between these two, and then Owen devolves into a complete Abby yes man from here on out. I'm sure there are many Last of Us 2 fans crying out, but Randy, Abby lost all of her friends and her group. Aren't those the consequences you're talking about? No, because it's constantly shown through her propensity of dragging them into dangerous situations, disregarding their input if it goes against her goals, emotionally blackmailing them at the expense of their well-being to service her goals, and showing no remorse in killing numerous people she must have known for years after befriending Lev, that she never cared for any of these people beyond their utility to her as tools. Christ, it's like Dexter Season 7 all over again, where the show desperately tried to push Hannah as this awesome and amazing person Dexter should totally trust, despite all of her backstabbing and conniving actions. Only Abby isn't able to bank on the fact she looks like Yvonne Strahovski to get around it. Regardless, it wouldn't change how horrible she comes across, even when the game tries to give her justified reasons to do so.
She had nothing to do with it. She's pregnant. Good.
You're a piece of shit, Abby.
You always have been. I'm done with you.
The main reason that Abby's story of a ruthless anti-hero becoming a reluctant hero fails is because there's no believable foundation behind why she strives to become a better person. When a character asks her point blank why is she betraying her people for 2 kids she met a day ago, this is her response.
Why did you come back for us?
Guilt.
Of what? You don't owe us anything.
I just needed to lighten the load a bit.
Okay, but what exactly is the load you're carrying? What is it you feel so guilty about? How does helping these kids make up for that guilt? Do you really expect people to believe you're turning a new leaf if you're willing to slit the throat of a pregnant girl just to spite somebody? Sorry, I still can't get over that last one. My point is, these aren't the kind of questions you give vague answers to if you want your audience to understand a character's perspective and motivations. If that much isn't clear to them, then how are they supposed to understand or empathize with anything that happens to that character? And, most importantly in a redemption story, believe anything they say pertaining to a character arc. You can't pass off Abby as a changed person if she still acts like the same hypocritical, impulsive sadist, despite all of the heartfelt music, quirky banter with her one-note companions, or forced bonding scenes to obfuscate the fact that when push comes to shove, she's always the first one to lash out in all of her encounters with Ellie, and always puts her needs first, even if they jeopardize the people she supposedly cares about. That's the mindset of a villain, plain and simple. Many studios these days seem to be having trouble figuring out what makes a true hero, and I believe it comes down to the obsession of trying to make every villain sympathetic, or every protagonist having loose morals and questionable judgment, just to make them appear more complex. The problem is, characters tend to become less believable or likable the harder the writer tries to make them appeal to everybody. By taking away their flaws, denying them any chance to struggle for what they want, or, in the worst cases, giving shallow justifications for why the audience should like them, it ends up making that character either a boring Mary Sue, or an artificial self-insert for the writer's beliefs. It's bad enough when it's done to heroic characters, but trying to make every villain and anti-hero like that completely undermines the point of even having them in the story. Think about it, if everyone in, say, Middle-earth were just as monstrous and backstabbing as the orcs, then why should anyone give a damn about further trying to save that world? If Lord of the Rings was just about a bunch of assholes quarreling with each other, then what incentive do I have to see any side win? That's not to say you can't give your heroic characters flaws or bad judgment calls, but Tolkien made it a story about good versus evil because he intended readers to be inspired by the convictions of characters like Aragorn and Frodo. Despite all of the challenges they face and the heavy burdens they carry, both literally and metaphorically, they're still willing to face those struggles head-on in order to protect what they care about most, and for the sake of every good-natured person in Middle-earth. Their stories would ring completely hollow if Aragorn just became a power-hungry tyrant out of nowhere, or if the hobbits were actually barbaric savages who abandoned their own at the first inconvenience. Oh wait, Amazon actually did that. On the flip side, what good does it do the story by trying to make the orcs sympathetic? Sure, you can tell people they care a lot about their leader, or they're just looking for a home, but that doesn't change the fact they're still savage monsters who enjoy killing innocent people, or even each other if they're hungry enough. Not to mention they don't seem to have any problems following Satan Incarnate over here, who I'm sure has nothing nefarious planned after he brings down both the last 3 kingdoms of Middle-earth. Seriously, trying to humanize Sauron was one of the dumbest things Rings of Power ever did, and that's saying a lot. Bottom line, moral relativism doesn't belong in a story all about good-natured people fighting against the ultimate evil in order to save the world. The same goes for trying to glorify an anti-hero without giving the audience clear reasons to be invested in them as people. Once your story loses the believability you've established for it, that's when everything else comes crashing down. And that's why it takes a skilled writer to know exactly how to implement a sympathetic villain or anti-hero, and be able to determine if their presence enhances the narrative they're going for. While I can appreciate the intention of trying to give every character a humane side in a story, it's also important to be able to call out when they're in the wrong despite those positive traits. It's a writer's job to always keep their audience immersed in their stories, and one of the fastest ways to break their suspension of disbelief is by forcing them to like terrible people through the most contrived methods possible. Thanks for watching. I love making review videos, but it's nice to do something different every now and then. If you're interested in seeing more videos about writing topics like this, let me know in the comments below. I'm the Elusive Eye. See you next time.